For centuries, the Himalayas formed an impenetrable border between China and India. The mountains have the highest peaks in the world, including Everest's 29,000 feet. And it's hard to imagine worse flying weather than what you find in the Himalayas. Winds that top 100 miles per hour are common. As they sweep the upside of the mountains, they create incredible updrafts that will suddenly lift an airplane at a rate of thousands of feet per minute, only to turn to downdrafts on the other side that push the airplane toward the earth at the same heart-sickening rate. And the threat of ice forming on the aircraft is ever present. Ice can be the pilot's worst enemy, especially the clear ice that forms fast and is hard to see. It disrupts the flow of the air over the wings that's required to provide the airplane's lift. Without quick correction, the airplane can no longer maintain altitude, even at full power. And inability to maintain altitude when flying in the Himalayas is a grave problem. Yet, in the spring of 1942, the fate of a major portion of the world was suddenly placed in the hands of young men who were willing to face those conditions, continually flying the Himalayas from India to China and back again. In 1937, the Japanese High Command knew it needed massive amounts of natural resources to carry out the Pacific Rim conquests it envisioned. So Japan invaded China to access those resources. 4 years later, when the United States entered World War II, the Japanese had as many as 2 million ground troops committed there. The U.S. and its allies desperately needed a besieged China to fight on and to continue to occupy those Japanese troops. Things turned dire in March and April of 1942 when Burma fell to the Japanese. That gave the enemy control of the western terminus of the Burma Road, the last overland supply artery into China.
China was solely dependent on supplies from the outer allies and so on that road. So the allies had to figure out how to get the material into China, or otherwise China was going to be out of the loop.
After the Doolittle raid, most of the raiders were sent home or on to other assignments. They'd been debriefed on the raid on May 1st, 1942 in Chongqing, the wartime capital city. After that, Dick and about 19 other raiders went to India and basically just waited at loose ends for new orders.
At that time, they established the 11th Bomb Squadron, who Brick Holstrom, who was one of the raiders, had been promoted to a major, and he was the commander. We had about 4 airplanes, maybe 30-some crews. They put out the word that they were looking for crews to man airplanes to fly the hump carrying supplies from India to China. So several of us decided to do that. I ended up flying the hump until June of 1943. I have a dim recollection of 60 trips, which would have been 120 back and forth.
India to China, you had to go over some pretty high mountains. Most of us flew directly back and forth across, did it in stages.
The dangers of flying the 530-mile-long passage over the Himalayan mountains, which became known as the Aluminum Trail, were many. But to DickCole and the young Americans who made those flights, it was simply part of the job. And the strange mix of modesty and bravado and even superstition present in the personalities of those young warriors caused them to discount the dangers. It wasn't a wall, it wasn't a barrier, it wasn't even a mountain range. It was just the hump. But the hump had extracted a terrible toll. Nearly 1,000 men and 600 Air Transport Command planes were lost by the end of the China-Burma-India Theater operations. Now, DickCole, who had flown it 120 or more times, had survived it. On April 29, 1943, he was, at last, released from assignment in the CBI Theater.
I was assigned to the ferry command set up at Dallas, Texas. And when I got to Dallas, I was reassigned to the Douglas plant at Tulsa, Oklahoma, as a ferry control officer. My job was to turn the paperwork over to the incoming crews. In some respects, it was pretty good because some of the pretty young ladies were flying airplanes.
At that point in the war, female pilots of the Women's Air Service Pilots, or WASPs, were picking up new airplanes from plants like the one where Cole worked in Tulsa and ferrying them to their points of debarkation into theaters of war.
I was supposed to test up a B-24. I went out to the airplane and was making a walk around, and this young lady came up on a bicycle. And she said, "I want to fly in a big airplane." I'm taking flying lessons to be a WASP at Spartan, which was across the field. And I said, "Well, you can't do that because we can't take people on test ops. Besides, there's no parachute." I got in the airplane and the co-pilot came, and so did the crew chief. So we fired up and took off. At about 12,000 feet, who came up into the cockpit area but this young lady. So we had to scrub the mission. We got on the ground, and I was filling out the form on, and the co-pilot took out a match cover thing, says, "Here," gave it to her, and said, "Put your telephone number on here." She did, wrote it out, and gave it to me.
The beautiful young stowaway was Lucia Marta Harrell from El Paso, Texas. Marta and her sister Christine had jobs at the Douglas plant. She was taking flying lessons and had planned to join the Women's Air Service Pilots when she completed her training. Well, Dick and Marta Cole had 5 children together, daughters Cindy and Christina, and sons Richard, Sam, and Andrew. Back in the China-Burma-India Theater, in which DickCole served so valiantly, hostilities were far from over. China was still a fractured and war-weary country, and while a supply chain created by the hump flights had kept her going, the need to reopen an overland supply route had become critical. Major General Ord Charles Wingate was a senior British Army officer. While serving in Palestine, he became a student of counterinsurgency and guerrilla tactics. In the spring of 1942, Wingate began advocating for long-range jungle penetration units that would operate behind Japanese lines in Burma. Well, Field Marshal Archibald Wavell gave him a brigade with which to test his plan, the Indian 77th Infantry Brigade. Wingate's brigade became known as the Chindits, believed to be a corruption of Chinthay, a name given to mythical Burmese lions who guarded the temple gates. They launched Operation Long Cloth into Burma on February 12, 1943. The Chindits had some initial success disrupting rail operations in Burma, but as they got deeper and deeper into the country, they found that much of their intelligence was unreliable. There were more roadways than they expected, so the Japanese were in constant pursuit, and they were interdicting Wingate's supplies besides. The situation became untenable as casualties mounted, and on March 22nd, Wingate was ordered to withdraw his troops. But word of Wingate's aggressive approach and innovative tactics, along with some of his open criticism of the British Army's conventional methods, had gotten the attention of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He invited Wingate to London. After hearing his ideas, Churchill invited Wingate to accompany him to a top-secret summit held in Quebec City, Canada, 1943. During the conference, President Roosevelt also heard Wingate's plan for another invasion of Burma, this time supported by air power. H. Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, later wrote of Wingate, quote, "He proved that Allied ground troops could operate behind enemy lines, cutting off his supply system and upsetting his schedule." In 1944, General Wingate wished to lead another expedition into Burma on a larger scale. "We envisioned a commando force, the first in military history. Large numbers of Allied ground troops would be conveyed by aircraft deep into Burma. We would not only evacuate all of the wounded by air, we would replace them with fresh combat troops." Obviously, the men to lead this unprecedented project had to be aggressive, imaginative, and endowed with organizational talent of a high order. One was a 34-year-old fighter pilot who had shown remarkable leadership in North Africa, Colonel Philip G. Cochran of Erie, Pennsylvania. At the time, I did not know that Cochran was the original character, Flip Corkin, in the comic strip Terry and the Pirates. The other man was John R. Allison, who had been an outstanding fighter pilot with the 14th Air Force in China, and had also fought the enemy from England, Russia, and the Middle East. He was short, slender, and self-possessed. He knew his business.
And we soon found out that General Arnold somehow had been talked into or had explained the advantages of this approach to the guerrilla-type warfare that was going on in Burma. Arnold explained that it was important to the Air Force, important to him, and he would like Phil Cochran and myself to take an active part in the development of this guerrilla-type warfare. Arnold had named 1st Air Commandos.
I got a call from Johnny Allison, who I had met before when he was there at Kunming with the fighter group. He wanted to know if I was interested in going back overseas. In the meantime, a young guy by the name of Jake Sartz, who I had roomed with while I was on the hump, called me and he says, "You want to go back overseas?" I said, "Are you going?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I'm going."
Johnny Allison's phone call came in mid-September of 1943. DickCole had been home from the CBI all of about 4 months. He jumped at the chance to go back. That decision had to be one of the first pieces of information he shared with the woman that he would marry just about a month later.
She turned out to be a very good Air Force wife. We had a honeymoon between Tulsa and North Carolina. I became the engineering officer, picked up the flight of 5 airplanes, and flew to India.
Getting the C-47s to the base in India took about a week, but the pilots had already been practicing for their mission while still in the United States. Before being dubbed the 1st Air Commandos, the unit was known simply as Project 9. Cochran and Allison had been given carte blanche to form the unit. For troop transport, they requisitioned 13 C-47s, 100 CG-4A Waco gliders, and 25 TG-5 training gliders. For casualty evacuation, they obtained a combined total of 100 Vultee L-1 Vigilants and Stinson L-5 Sentinels and 4 Sikorsky YR-4 helicopters. For fighter cover, 30 North American P-51 Mustangs were acquired. Later in India, the Air Commandos would receive 12 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. For personnel, they wanted only volunteers, men who understood the risks, men who understood the stakes, men who didn't hesitate, men like DickCole.
We knew what we were going to do and how we were going to do it because we had briefings and we even practiced how it was going to work. So I think we were pretty well trained to try and do what we wanted to do.
The invasion was set for March 5th, 1944. It would be a night mission, codenamed Operation Thursday. Just before departure, Phil Cochran addressed the men, including DickCole.
Now, is there anything anybody doesn't know? If there is, let's get it straight now. Now, tonight, your whole reason for being, your whole existence is going to be jammed up into a couple minutes, and you're just going to balance it there, and it's going to take your character to bring it through. Now, nothing you've ever done before in your life means a thing. Tonight, you're going to find out you've got a soul. Good luck.
That was an interesting message to a man, DickCole, who had already visited downtown Tokyo as a Doolittle Raider.
I'll have to check. Maybe it was a full moon, but there was moonlight, but clear. We took off full power and climbed up to 8,000 feet to clear the mountains. Things were pretty smooth until we reached the hills over in Burma. The air was rough. My rope broke over the hills, of Himalaya hills there, and both gliders had to go down. All the crew people were saved except one that drowned swimming across the river. I radioed back to the base about the rough air, and I wasn't the only one that had a broken rope. There were several others. Though
most of the gliders were damaged or destroyed, and the force suffered 30 killed and 33 injured in crash landings, 539 men and almost 30,000 pounds of supplies were positioned deep inside Burma that night. Incredibly, the troops built a runway for the C-47s overnight. And within 2 days, by March 11, approximately 9,000 men, 500,000 pounds of supplies, and about 1,200 mules and 175 ponies were transported in. A substantial operational base, complete with airstrip, was established 200 miles behind Japanese lines.
With all the problems on the ground, we still had a runway available the next night. And we landed our C-47s and made a couple trips.
Operation Thursday and the advent of the first air commandos was a mortal blow to the Japanese and the dawn of a new day for the besieged and beleaguered defenders of China, at that time an ally of the United States.
No, it lasted until about July. I got to come home the end of the July.
Indeed, DickCole got to come home. He was relieved from active duty in January of 1947. He started to go back to college, to think briefly again about that other boyhood dream, being a forest ranger. But DickCole had long ago found his soul. Maybe a bit of it was always just down the street from his boyhood home in the Wright brothers' bicycle shop. Maybe he found a little more of it sitting on the levees above McCook Field, watching the great McCready and the immortal Doolittle. Much of it he discovered in the service to his country. He retired from the Air Force in 1967 as a lieutenant colonel. DickCole's decorations include the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal with 1 oak leaf cluster, the Bronze Star, the Air Force Commendation Medal, a Presidential Unit Citation, and the Chinese Army, Navy, Air Corps Medal Class A, first grade. But for men like DickCole, it's never about the medals.
I was thinking through the courtesy of the U.S. Army and Army Air Corps. I've been around the world twice and a big boat tour. Just happened to have been a very lucky person.